Welcome! Today we journey to Inglewood, an historic gold mining town in central Victoria, to visit the final resting place of an English convict. She was one of two sisters, transported to Australia in 1841 for the crime of stealing linen from a hedge. Her name was Caroline Burt. Inglewood is known for its eucalyptus distilleries, and I use quite a bit of the eucalyptus that comes from this town in a variety of products in my home. Now, as you can see, I'm actually headed outside of the town in search of the old Inglewood Cemetery. And I found it very hard to find information about this cemetery or the people who are buried there. Caroline's death certificate records her as being in the old Inglewood Cemetery. But it is interesting that in the same year, 1862, when Caroline died, the first burials happened at the cemetery in town. So I'm not 100% sure whether Caroline is out here at the old site or in the newer cemetery. So I've decided to show you both. Caroline, baptised Catherine, was born in 1826 in the village of Litchett Matravers near Poole in Dorset. Her older sister Jane was born 2 years earlier, and she was also a native of the same village. In 1840, when Caroline was just 14 and Jane 16, the two sisters were charged at the Dorset quarter sessions with stealing a cap and a handkerchief. Their convict records note that the items were stolen from a hedge. Perhaps they had been left there to dry, as was common at the time. Who knows? Caroline, who had a prior conviction for stealing a pair of stockings from a local draper, alongside another sister named Sarah, was sentenced to 10 years transportation. Jane, with no previous offences, received a sentence of 7 years. Caroline's jail report noted that she had bad connections, a phrase often used at the time to suggest poor influences or associations. Both girls worked as farm servants, milkmaids and kitchen maids, typical occupations for young women of their social standing. They had received a modest education through the local church, which was often the only source of instruction available to working class families at the time. Unfortunately for the girls, petty crime appeared to run in the family, likely a consequence of poverty and limited opportunity. Their father and older brother were both charged with receiving stolen goods, though they were ultimately acquitted. Following their conviction, Caroline and Jane were transferred to Millbank Prison in London to await transportation. Now, there are no Hulk records for the sisters, so it is likely they remained in Millbank Prison until they were placed aboard the Rajah in April 1841. Now, that may sound familiar to some of you. The Rajah. Unbeknownst to the sisters, they would soon benefit from the work of Christian philanthropist and pioneering reformer Elizabeth Fry, and play a role in creating a piece of history that now hangs in the National Gallery of Australia. Elizabeth Fry, née Gurney, was born into a wealthy Quaker family in 1780. Around the age of 17, she was deeply moved to put her faith into action after hearing a sermon by American Quaker William Savery. With a strong sense of compassion for the poor and vulnerable, and encouraged by friends, she visited Newgate Prison in 1813, and what she saw there shocked her to the core. Women and children were confined alongside men in overcrowded, squalid cells. The warders were all male, leaving the women entirely at their mercy. As noted by writer Ruth Elizabeth Stiff, The conditions were chaotic and terrifying. Many of the women were drunk and violent, living in constant fear. Fry returned the following day with clothing, food, and other essential supplies. More importantly, she brought with her a deep resolve to reform the prison system for women. The Female Factory Research Centre in Hobart has written on their website about an incident where Elizabeth Fry and a companion named Mrs. Pryor visited the transportation ship the Mary Ann in 1822, and they wrote of seeing the women from Lancaster Castle, which was a prison, arriving not merely handcuffed but wearing heavy irons on their legs, which caused considerable swelling and even serious inflammation. Researchers believe that Elizabeth Fry might have been the author of the following letter written to the London Morning Herald in 1822. Sir, this occurred on board a female convict ship, the Mary Ann, which I visited at Woolwich last December in company with a benevolent friend. Our attention was forcibly drawn to a convict named Isabella Hamill, whose wretched condition was peculiarly calculated to excite commiseration. She had been sent from Lancaster, chained to 3 other females, on the outside of a stagecoach, where they all remained the greater part of 3 days and nights. During this tedious period, when the calls of nature or any other pressing want made it necessary for one to get down, her request, how urgent soever, could not be granted unless she could prevail on the other 3 to get down and accompany her. Dear me. This inconvenience, though great and revolting to every feeling of propriety, because the keeper was always unavoidably present, formed but a small part of the above-mentioned unhappy women's sufferings. One of the fetters with which she was bound acted as an implement of torture and became literally buried in the flesh of her leg. At the time I saw her, the surgeon, Dr. Hall, said that the swelling and inflammation was greatly reduced, but that for some days previously he expected the whole limb would mortify. There are many more stories of the pure hell female convicts were put through. Elizabeth Fry's reforms were not only compassionate, they were methodical and far-reaching. She began by organising the women in Newgate Prison into a self-governing group known as the Association for the Improvement of the Female Prisoners in Newgate, which introduced structure and accountability among inmates, including that prisoners be housed according to their crimes. For example, murderers and rapists separated from pickpocketers. She established a schoolroom within the prison where children and illiterate women could receive basic education. Recognising the importance of purposeful activity, she introduced work programs, particularly sewing and needlework, which not only occupied the women's time, but also equipped them with skills they could use upon release or during transportation to the Australian colonies. Now, just down here, down this road, is what I believe the site of the old Inglewood Cemetery. Today it's just a paddock, and I believe the house on the right that you can't see, but is a farmhouse, and I believe they're growing crops on it at the moment. So if I'm wrong and you know where the Inglewood or the old Inglewood Cemetery is, please let me know in the comments, because this is where Google led me, my research led me, but please, let me know if I'm right or wrong. And just up here on the right, nice green grass, is where Caroline possibly lies today. Many women and children suffered the indignity of not having enough clothing. And Elizabeth also introduced the use of covered coaches to protect female prisoners from public humiliation during their transfer to waiting ferries. Fry also advocated for moral and religious instruction, often reading from the Bible and encouraging reflection and reform. Her insistence on female warders for female prisoners was groundbreaking. Fry lobbied Parliament and worked closely with influential figures, leading to the Jails Act of 1823, which legally mandated many of her reforms, including gender segregation, regular inspections, and improved sanitation. Her influence extended to the transportation ships bound for Australia, where she ensured that women were provided with sewing kits and materials. As transportees on board the Rajah, both Caroline and Jane would have been given the opportunity to assist in the making of the Rajah Quilt. The quilt is a powerful symbol of compassion, creativity and reform, created by the female convicts on board the Rajah during their voyage to Tasmania. Elizabeth Fry's organisation, the British Ladies' Society for the Reformation of Female Prisoners, provided each woman on board the Rajah with fabric, needles, thread, pins and scissors before the ship departed for Woolwich. Supporting the women on this journey was Kaiser Hayter, I hope I'm saying that right, a free woman, employee of Millbank Penitentiary and a committed reform advocate. Appointed by the British Ladies' Society, she served as matron on board the Rajah, tasked with guiding and supervising the women throughout the voyage. Her presence was instrumental in encouraging the convicts to engage in meaningful creative labour, such as the making of the Rajah quilt. Upon arriving in Tasmania, Kaiser continued her reform work by assisting Lady Jane Franklin, the governor's wife, in establishing the Tasmanian Ladies' Society for the Reformation of Female Prisoners. During the journey, around 29 women collaborated to create the large, intricate quilt using over 2,800 pieces of fabric. The result is a beautifully crafted patchwork, appliqué and embroidered quilt, presented to Lady Jane Franklin, the governor's wife, upon their arrival in Hobart on the 19th of July 1841. A fine cross-stitched inscription on the quilt's border expressed the women's gratitude to the British Ladies' Society, a rare gesture as most items made by convicts were kept or sold. The quilt's design follows the medallion or framed style, I hope I'm saying that right, popular in the late 18th century England and Ireland, and rows of printed cotton patchwork that reflect the textile fashions of the time. I wonder if Caroline and Jane were a part of the project and what part of the quilt they created. Today, the Rajah quilt is celebrated not only for its historical significance, but also for its artistic beauty and symmetry. It stands as a rare and moving example of 19th century Australian women's art and a testament to the resilience and dignity of the women who made it under extraordinary circumstances. The Rajah arrived in Van Diemen's Land in July 1841, and upon arrival, Caroline and Jane were taken to the Cascades Female Factory. The sisters were promptly assigned to different families in separate parts of Tasmania. Jane was placed with a Mr. Bastian at Woodstock in Richmond, while Caroline was assigned to Mr. Tabart in the Eastern Marshes, now known as Andover. By December, both girls had been reassigned. Jane was in Sorrel, working for a Mr. Peacock, and Caroline had moved to Oatlands, where she was assigned to a Mr. W. Jones. Caroline's record remained free of misdemeanours throughout her sentence, whereas Jane had a few infractions. Unfortunately, I've been unable to locate the details of her misconduct that led to her appearance in the Richmond Lower Court in February of 1842. In September of the same year, Jane had been assigned to a Mr. Hopkins, and she was charged with being drunk and disorderly, as well as for admitting men into her master's house after he had retired for the night. Mr. Hopkins stated, "I was awake at about 2 o'clock on Sunday morning by screaming. I went to the kitchen where I found the 2 prisoners. They were drunk and had been fighting. As a result, Jane was sentenced to 3 months hard labour at the female factory in Hobart." One possible reason Caroline may have avoided trouble was that she met her future husband, George Goodall, just a month after her assignment to Oatlands. George and Caroline applied for permission to marry. George was a 22-year-old free man born in Scotland, and he was working as a stonemason. Their initial application for marriage was declined, not because Caroline was only 15 years old, gosh, but because she had only been in the colony for a few months. And at the time, convicts were required to serve at least 12 months in the colony before being eligible to marry, as this period was considered unnecessary for assessing their character during probation. Now, as soon as Caroline's 12-month period had passed, the couple reapplied and were granted permission to marry. And a month later, they were wed at the Oatlands courthouse. Almost exactly a year later, Caroline gave birth to their first child, a son named George Alfred after his father. At the time she was married, Caroline was still serving her sentence, and the couple remained in Oatlands until at least 1850. And during this period, Caroline gave birth to 3 more sons, Alexander, Andrew Thomas and William. And tragically, young Alexander died at just 6 weeks and 5 days old from convulsions. Caroline received her ticket of leave in 1845, and she was officially freed by servitude in 1850. By 1844, Jane was holding a probation pass, and she was working for a Mr. John Niblett on Liverpool Street in Hobart. A probation pass allowed a convict to earn wages, the amount depending on the class of pass they held. Jane was most likely employed as a domestic servant. In August of 1845, Jane was granted her ticket of leave, and a year later she received a conditional pardon on the condition that she remain within Van Diemen's Land, the Australian colonies or New Zealand. In 1847, she was freed by servitude, meaning she was no longer under penal control. A short time later, she was issued a certificate of freedom, the official document confirming she had served her full term and was legally free. The next time Jane appears in the records, she is in Oatlands, having travelled north to join her sister Caroline. There, she found work as a domestic servant, and no doubt she was eager not only to be closer to her sister, but also to meet her young nephews, probably for the first time. Now, it was shortly after her arrival in Oatlands that she met her future husband, James Wright. James was a 30-year-old free man, and he was actually the grandson of 3 convicts: Joseph Wright, who arrived on the Scarborough on the First Fleet, and Eleanor Gott and Sarah Griggs, both of whom were transported on the notorious Neptune. The Neptune was part of the Second Fleet, and it's remembered for having some of the most horrific conditions in the history of convict transportation to Australia. Convicts suspected of even minor thefts were reportedly flogged to death, and all were kept in chains below deck for the entire voyage. I plan to share more about that voyage in an upcoming video. Now, Jane and James were married in January 1848 in Oatlands, Tasmania. Later that year, Jane gave birth to their first son, Edward. By 1849, the young family had relocated to Burra in South Australia, a move likely influenced by the town's rapid rise as a global centre of copper production. During their years in South Australia, Jane gave birth to 4 more children, expanding their growing family. Around 1857 or about 58, they moved once again, this time settling in Smeaton in Victoria. And it is probable that they relocated to join Caroline and George, who had also established themselves in Smeaton around that time. Smeaton was situated near the thriving goldfields of Creswick, Clunes and Ballarat, and it offered the promise of opportunity and prosperity. The proximity to these gold rush sites suggests that the families may have chosen to reunite there in pursuit of their fortune and a better future. Now, Caroline and George had been in Bendigo since 1853, where George was working as a miner in Spring Gully. Caroline gave birth to a daughter, Ellen, and a son, James, in Bendigo, bringing her total to 7 children. She gave birth to her 8th and final child in Smeaton in 1859. Jane also gave birth to 2 more children in Smeaton. Now, unfortunately, as was often the case in colonial Australia, tragedy struck in 1861. 4 of Caroline's children and Jane's eldest daughter died. I was able to purchase young Ellen's death certificate, and I found that she had died of diphtheria. Now, diphtheria is a serious and contagious disease caused by bacteria, which mostly affects the throat and can make it hard to breathe. It's not nice. In 1861, on the Victorian Goldfields, diphtheria was a real danger, especially for children living in rough, crowded conditions with poor sanitation. Families often lived in tents or huts without clean water or proper waste disposal, which made it easier for disease to spread. When diphtheria outbreaks occurred, they could cause many deaths in a short time and bring fear to whole communities. Medical help was limited and treatments were not always available. So a case of diphtheria often meant a family tragedy, which is what I believe has happened here. Life on the goldfields was already tough, and diseases like diphtheria made survival even harder. I believe the 5 children probably died of the disease, and what a tragic time for the sisters and their families. The children are all buried in Smeaton. Now, as you can see, I'm exploring the back of the cemetery looking for the Chinese graves. Now, unfortunately, at the Inglewood Cemetery, there wasn't even a sign indicating there were any Chinese graves, but I knew it had Goldfields history, so I persisted. It was also interesting to see a hospital section of the cemetery. Now, I've never seen that before. I'm sure they exist, and let me know if you have a hospital section at your local cemetery, but I've never seen this. And I am assuming that it's stillborn babies, pauper deaths, things like that. I don't know. I could not find any other information online or at the cemetery. So if you know more about the hospital deaths at the Inglewood Cemetery, please leave a comment and let us know. And another thing I noticed about this cemetery, there were a lot of graves, grave sites, mounds where people were buried that had no headstones, even no numbers. So a lot, and I was quite surprised. So I'm not sure about that either. If you know more, please let us know. Now, can you see that in the distance there? I knew that they would be here. The Chinese graves. There they are at the back of the cemetery, and unfortunately not signed. So if anyone is on the Inglewood Cemetery Trust, please let me know. Is there plans to have signage? What's the situation? Because these are very, important historical parts of our Victorian history, our Goldfields history. And there they are. I think I counted about 5 that I could find. Of course, there were other, definitely other mounds, I guess you'd call them, where I knew bodies were. I'm just not sure if they were Chinese or not. Could not find a Jewish section of the cemetery either, but I'm sure they're there as well. Now, unfortunately, there had been some trees that had fallen on top of one of the headstones. Sorry. So it's a very neglected part of the cemetery, which was very disappointing. A year after the tragic deaths of her 4 children, Caroline, George and their 3 surviving children had settled in Inglewood, a town north of Bendigo. Gold had been discovered there in 1859, sparking a massive influx of fortune seekers. By early 1860, a new goldfield known as New Inglewood was established, quickly evolving into the site of the present-day township. By the mid-1860s, the population had surged to over 40,000, making it one of the most significant gold rushes in Victoria. Tragically, not long after their arrival, Caroline died of bronchitis. Once again, the harsh and primitive conditions of the Victorian goldfields had claimed a life far too soon. Caroline was just 36 years old. I can find no record of Jane or her family being in Inglewood. In 1867, Jane gave birth to her 7th child, a daughter named Jane, at Kensington Hill, now known as Leopold, near Geelong. Jane and her family eventually ended up in Flynn's Creek. Now, Flynn's Creek, now known as Flynn, is located between Traralgon and Sale in eastern Victoria. Jane lived a long life and died in 1911 at the age of 90. A lovely obituary was written about her life in the Traralgon Record on the 12th of December 1911 on page 3. The death of Mrs. J. Wright. Another old pioneer of this district passed away on Friday evening last in the person of Mrs. Jane Wright of Flynn's Creek at the ripe old age of 90. The deceased lady was the widow of the late Mr. James Wright of Flynn's Creek, who died about 10 years ago, and since that time she has resided with her son Thomas. The late Mrs. Wright was very highly esteemed by all who knew her, and during her long residence of 41 years at Flynn's Creek had made numerous friends throughout the district. She was a bright and cheerful old lady, and on the Friday prior to her death seemed to be in the best of health and spirits, as she talked and joked with her relatives. The next morning, however, she took a bad turn, and this was the commencement of a gradual fading away, and the end peacefully came as stated above. The deceased was a native of Dorsetshire and came to Victoria some 54 years ago, after a few years' residence in Adelaide and Tasmania, at which place she was married. They settled at Flynn's Creek and followed farming pursuits. She leaves a family of 7 sons and daughters to mourn her loss. What a great obituary. It's very interesting to note there is no mention of her convict history at all. Now I have something very exciting to share with you, an image of Jane, and there she is with her husband James, and I'd say she was about maybe 80 years old here. Now I don't usually publish images of convicts that are on private trees. but this was on a public website. There's a couple of websites that this image is on, so I thought it was okay to publish here. And even more exciting, I have used my heritage deep nostalgia to bring Jane to life. I love AI. I know some of you are not fans of AI, but I absolutely love it, and the possibilities and what it can do. And here's Jane. Wow. Caroline and Jane's lives were shaped by hardship, resilience, and the bond they shared as sisters. From their early years in Dorset to their final days in Victoria, their journeys reflect the experiences of many convict women who helped shape colonial Australia, and modern day Australia, I might add. Though their paths were marked by loss and struggle, they also built families, found moments of stability, and left behind a quiet legacy. Their part in the making of the Rajah Quilt connects them to a powerful story of endurance and reform, a lasting reminder of the suffering so many women endured in the making of our modern nation. We remember them as part of our extraordinary convict history.